In such a question, it's very easy for the test taker to make judgments based on how this sentence actually sounds and how the answer choices sound with the original sentence itself. Because when we vertically scan through the answer choices, we can see that there is no room to apply any of the 7 concepts. So, in such situations, test takers must always remember that they could apply the concepts of construction and also logic, because GMAT does always test for logic of the question, and we can still do this by way of whatever differences are present in the answer choices. So let's try this. Now we can see that the original sentence reads that this company hopes that by doing something, comma. Now the underlined portion starts after the comma, and in answer choice A alone we have that. The rest of the answer choices don't start that way. So let's look at whether this is actually a proper construction, because the non-underlined portion says that this company hopes that. So if I say the test taker hopes that, or the student hopes that, the student hopes that by studying hard, that he can get a great score. Would we actually speak like this? Because if I say the student hopes that by doing something, by doing this, should I say the that again? Or can I directly say that by studying hard, he can get a great score? So we can see that the second that is actually redundant here. This construction does not work. So we can get rid of A. Now let's look at the other choices. B says enough has been set aside and can be paid, and it will have no longer to use it. Now, people might judge this as something that sounds wrong, because we might choose to say, and it will no longer have to, rather than it will have no longer to. There's actually not much of a difference here. So basically, the construction is fine, and the way it's trying to convey the meaning is also fine, that enough has been set aside with which something can be paid, and it will have no longer to use its blah blah. So we can actually hold on to B. Let's keep this and maybe inspect this further when we get down to 2 answer choices. Now let's look at C. It has set aside enough for payment of these claims and thus no longer having. D says enough has been set aside to pay for. Now one quick difference that we can notice is C says payment of and D and E say payment for. Now idiomatically, how do I use this construction? How would I say payment of? So if I say John, for example, has made a payment, that would be the payment of John, right? Because the payment belongs to John. He has made a payment. But then, can I say that John has made a payment of his interest? So if I say it's the payment of his interest, am I trying to say that the payment belongs to the interest? No, right? We are trying to say that he has paid his interest. So it is not right to say that it is payment of his interest. It would be right to say that it is payment for his interest, because that is what he is paying for. Get it? So the payment of the claims is not right, because the payment doesn't belong to these claims. It is right to say that it is a payment for these claims. So we can get rid of C. Now let's look at D and E. Again, there are so many differences in construction, but one thing we can see is that after the comma, we have the thus no longer having to use it, right? Now, how does this construction work? It's okay to use the thus after the comma, so please do not get rid of this again because it sounds wrong or something. But let's look at how this can be used. So for example, we can write, the book was torn, thus having to be replaced. So in this case, please don't mistake that this having is actually a verb. It's actually being constructed in the present participle form as a modifier. So what is having to be replaced here? This book, because it was torn, correct? So since this book was torn, this had to be replaced. Now what we can see is that this present participle modifier is actually applying to the subject of this particular sentence, this particular clause. The book was torn, thus having to be replaced. So the same way, if we apply this concept here, thus no longer having to use it, if we take a look at the previous clause, we can see that the subject of this particular clause is actually enough, which is referring to the money, right? That money has been set aside. So if we use this example and relate it to this answer choice, we can see that this thus no longer having is actually modifying the subject of the clause, the money. So is the money no longer having to use something? Now that is absolutely illogical, correct? So we know that by this logic, by this construction, D can be eliminated. So we're down to B and E. Now E reads, it has set aside enough to pay for these claims and will no longer have to. Now, one thing that we've commonly seen is that and is a trigger for parallelism. So in this case, what is the parallel construction here? That this company has set aside enough and this company will no longer have to. So this is the verb, this is an action by the company and this is also an action by the company. It has done this and will no longer have to do this. So these two verbs are properly parallel. In the same way, if we look at this, we do have an and in B, and this clause reads enough has been set aside with which something can be paid and it will no longer have to use it. Now, there is nothing wrong with this construction except for the concept of passive voice. Now, GMAT has a tendency to prefer active voice over the passive. So, if you notice the main difference between B and E says this company has set aside enough, whereas B says enough has been set aside by the company and it can be paid, whereas here it is saying it has set aside enough to pay for these claims. So this is a passive construction, this is a passive construction, but this clause and this particular clause are all in active voice. So we can get rid of B. This leaves you with the right answer choice, E for echo. So this was a slightly complicated process of elimination because of the various things that you had to look for. But then the point is this. Keep in mind to look for the differences and think upon these differences, not simply in terms of the 7 concepts that we have, but also in terms of the construction and logic. And on a side note, let me point out how can the conjunction thus be actually used. See, hence and thus are very interchangeable, more or less the same. But if we look at the logic of the question, we can see that this company has set aside enough, thus no longer having to do something, right? We can understand from the logic itself that it is an action that is meant for the future. So please remember that the word thus cannot be used for something that is supposed to happen in the future. In such cases, we use hence. So for example, he wants a great score. So here you can't say thus he has to study hard. Here we say hence he has to work hard. But if we talk about an action in the past, we can say that he studied hard, thus he got a great score. So please remember this meaning-based difference as well could be useful in the future.